When British soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they carried rifles that were already almost 50 years old. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, first made in 1895 and officially adopted in 1907, was still the main weapon used by all Commonwealth troops. Their German enemies carried the Karabiner 98K, a newer version of the famous Mauser rifle that had been improved over many years. On paper, the British rifle seemed outmatched. The German gun was more accurate at long distances, built from newer materials, and often called the best bolt-action design ever made. Yet British soldiers who picked up German rifles during battles often threw them away and kept using their own Lee-Enfields. This wasn't because they were stubborn or overly proud. It was because experience had taught them which weapon truly worked best in real combat. The Lee-Enfield's story began back in the 1880s, when the British Army realized it needed a repeating rifle that used smokeless powder. A Scottish-Canadian inventor named James Paris Lee created a new idea: a removable box magazine that could hold several bullets. When his design was combined with the rifled barrel made by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, the result was the magazine Lee-Enfield. It was first used in the Second Boer War. By 1907, after several improvements, the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, called the SMLE, appeared. This rifle would go on to serve in 2 world wars and many colonial conflicts. What kept this rifle in service for almost a century wasn't one amazing invention. It was a mix of smart design choices that focused on what truly mattered in a fight. In those days, most military leaders cared mainly about long-range accuracy. European armies trained to hit targets 800, 1,000, or even 1,500 yards away. The Germans were especially proud of their sharpshooters, and their Mauser rifles were built with longer barrels and very tight mechanical fit. The British thought differently. They shortened the SMLE's barrel to about 25 inches, so soldiers could handle it more easily in trenches and vehicles. They didn't mind giving up some long-range accuracy, because their studies showed that most battles happened within 300 yards. Other European experts called this idea foolish, but it turned out to be exactly right once trench warfare began in 1914. The rifle's rear-locking bolt design surprised gun experts. Most military rifles, including the Mauser, had front locking lugs near the chamber to handle the pressure when firing. The Lee-Enfield's lugs were at the back of the bolt, which some thought made it weaker and less accurate. Critics said it could never match the Mauser's precision. They were correct at shooting ranges, but real battlefields were a different story. The Lee-Enfield's design gave advantages that mattered far more than small accuracy differences at 600 yards. The longer bolt movement caused by the rear locking system actually made it faster to fire again, and the action worked, even when dirt or mud got inside. By 1939, when Britain went to war with Germany again, the SMLE was technically outdated. But instead of stopping production, factories in Britain, India, and Australia built millions more. Commanders didn't hold on to it for tradition's sake. They knew that what looked perfect on paper didn't always win real battles. The British Army had a tough training goal that sounded impossible to new recruits. Each soldier had to shoot 15 aimed bullets per minute using the bolt-action Lee-Enfield. The best could even reach 30. This was called the Mad Minute, and it wasn't just for show. It became a core battle skill that saved British forces during the first months of World War I on August 23, 1914. Near the Belgian town of Mons, about 70,000 British troops faced nearly 160,000 Germans. The Germans expected an easy win against what they thought was an outdated army. Instead, they ran into a storm of rifle fire so heavy that they believed they were being attacked by hidden machine guns. They weren't. It was British riflemen doing exactly what they'd trained to do. The SMLE's design made quick shooting possible. Its bolt handle was set at a 60-degree angle instead of 90, like most rifles. This shorter movement meant less motion between shots, and soldiers could keep their hands in a natural position. The rifle's rear-locking bolt fired when closing, not opening, which felt more natural when shooting fast. When the bolt opened, the empty cartridge popped out smoothly without fighting a spring. The shooter could focus completely on loading the next round. With constant practice, British soldiers became incredibly fast shooters. Training was strict. They spent weeks on the rifle range before learning anything else. They practiced shooting while standing, kneeling, sitting, and lying down. They changed magazines until they could do it in less than 3 seconds. They learned to guess distances by eye and move their sights accordingly. The SMLE's ladder sight system looked old-fashioned compared to German rifles, but it was quicker to use under stress. You just flipped a lever, slid the sight to the distance you needed, and locked it in place. No tiny adjustments, just fast action. To pass the Mad Minute test, a soldier had to hit a 12-inch target at 300 yards 15 times in 1 minute. That meant reloading while still hitting the target. Those who managed 20 hits became marksmen. A famous instructor named Sergeant Instructor Snoxall once hit 38 targets in a minute in 1914 with an assistant handing him loaded magazines. The goal wasn't to set records, it was to train soldiers so their speed and accuracy became automatic during battle. At Mons, German troops marching in lines were stopped by rifle fire from ranges they could hardly shoot back from. Reports said entire German companies were halted by what seemed like continuous machine gun fire from many positions. But in truth, small groups of 8 to 10 British riflemen created that wall of bullets. A captured German officer later told his interrogators he had counted the shots and thought his unit faced at least 20 machine guns. He couldn't believe bolt-action rifles could fire that fast. The British had only 4 machine guns per battalion at Mons. The rest was just rifles, training, and the Lee-Enfield's amazing speed doing exactly what it was built to do. Trench warfare was every gun designer's worst nightmare. Things that looked perfect in clean factories often failed in the mud and chaos of the front lines. Rifles stayed out for days or even weeks in rain, snow, and the sticky mud of Flanders. That mud wasn't just dirt. It was thick, clay-like, and got into every tiny space of a weapon. Soldiers couldn't take care of their rifles the way manuals suggested. There were no warm armories or clean work tables. Cleaning supplies often ran out. Sometimes all they could do was wipe off moisture and hope the gun oil they had left would last a bit longer. In those awful conditions, the Lee-Enfield performed beautifully. While many modern rifles jammed or broke, the Enfield kept firing. Its secret was in how it was made. British factories built the rifles with slightly looser parts than German factories did. That meant the moving parts had more space between them. To an engineer, this looked like bad craftsmanship. But to a soldier stuck in mud and cold, it meant survival. When dirt or ice got into the gun, the Lee-Enfield's extra space allowed it to keep working. The bolt might feel rough, but it still moved. The German Mauser, 98K, built with tighter fits and front-locking lugs right near the chamber, where mud and sand collected, often jammed completely. German soldiers sometimes struggled to clear their rifles, while British troops kept shooting. The Lee-Enfield also had a big advantage with its cock-on-closing design. That meant the mainspring only got compressed when the bolt was pushed closed. So, opening the bolt took less effort. If the rifle started sticking from dirt or rust, the soldier could still pull it open easily to eject a stuck shell or fix a jam. The Mauser's cock-on opening system made this much harder because the soldier had to fight both the spring pressure and the jam at the same time. In freezing weather, this difference became life-saving. Metal parts shrank in the cold, and even a little moisture could turn to ice inside the gun. British troops in the winter of 1917 said their Lee-Enfields kept firing when German rifles were frozen solid. The Germans weren't lazy about cleaning. Their guns were just less forgiving in harsh weather. The Enfield's design also handled water smartly. Its magazine had a cut-off switch that let soldiers fire 1 bullet at a time, while keeping the full magazine ready for emergencies. More importantly, the magazine well had small holes for drainage. If water got in, it could drip out instead of staying trapped and causing rust or jammed bullets. The Mauser didn't have this. Its internal magazine had no drainage, so water mixed with oil and gunpowder dust inside, forming a sticky paste that caused corrosion. After battles, British weapon repair teams often found that captured Mausers had rust inside their magazines, even when the outside looked fine. The Lee-Enfield's wooden parts helped too. Its stock was made mostly from walnut wood, usually Indian walnut, which was softer than the beechwood used in many Mausers. This softer wood absorbed shocks without cracking. Soldiers used their rifles for all kinds of rough tasks, hammering tent stakes, opening crates, even breaking ice. The Enfield's stock survived those hits, while the Mausers often split or shattered. A broken stock wasn't just ugly, it could throw off a gun's aim or even make it unsafe to fire. British repair reports from big battles like the Somme said Lee-Enfields rarely came back with broken stocks, unlike captured German rifles that broke more easily under rough use. The Mauser 98K was still an incredible design, and many countries copied it later. Its system fed bullets smoothly, its locking lugs handled the pressure perfectly, and it had a safe and clever 3-position safety switch. On shooting ranges, the Mauser was the king of accuracy. German soldiers trained to be expert marksmen, and their rifles reflected that. At 600 yards, a skilled German shooter could hit more targets than a British one using the Lee-Enfield. But battles aren't fought calmly on shooting ranges. Soldiers were scared, tired, and under attack. They needed guns that worked fast, not perfectly. The Mauser's careful precision became a weakness when every second mattered. A trained German could fire about 10 to 12 aimed shots a minute with the Mauser 98K. That was good, but only half what a British soldier could do with the Lee-Enfield. In a 2-minute firefight, the British could shoot 30 rounds while Germans fired around 24. Those extra bullets could mean the difference between winning and losing a fight. Multiply that across a whole platoon, and the British could fill the air with hundreds more bullets in the same time. Because of that, German tactics relied more on machine guns like the MG-34 and MG-42 for covering fire. The British could get that level of firepower with just their rifles. The Mauser's barrel was slightly longer, about 23.6 inches compared to the Enfield's 25.2, and that made its bullets travel a bit faster and straighter. German snipers loved it for that reason. But for most soldiers, that extra accuracy didn't matter. Studies during both World Wars showed that in real battles, fear, exhaustion, and noise ruined a soldier's aim more than any gun's accuracy could fix. The Lee-Enfield was accurate enough for the short distances where most fighting happened. Its faster firing speed made it more dangerous in real combat. Even the magazine size made a big difference. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds in a removable box magazine, while the Mauser had only 5 rounds loaded through metal clips. The 2-to-1 advantage mattered a lot. A British squad could fire twice as long before reloading, and when they did reload, it took only about 3 seconds. Drop the empty magazine, click in a full one, and you were ready to go. A German soldier had to open the bolt, line up a 5-round clip, press the bullets in by hand, pull out the empty clip, and close the bolt. That could take 6 to 8 seconds if nothing jammed. In real fights, that was valuable time lost. When you compare a British section of 10 men with a German one, the difference gets huge. The British could fire 100 rounds before reloading, the Germans only 50. Over a few minutes, the British would fire hundreds more bullets, keeping constant pressure on the enemy while the Germans paused to reload. That continuous fire helped British troops move forward or hold positions more easily. And because their magazines were detachable, soldiers could carry spare loaded magazines in pouches and swap them fast. A standard British loadout gave each soldier about 100 rounds, 50 ready in magazines and 50 more in belts for refilling. German soldiers carried their bullets in small clips, which were harder to reload under stress. Drop one in mud, and those 5 rounds might be useless. The Lee-Enfield also had a magazine cutoff switch that let soldiers save their ammo. They could fire 1 bullet at a time, then flip the switch to use the full magazine instantly if things got dangerous. The Mauser couldn't do that. The Lee-Enfield's wide magazine opening also made it easier to reload in the dark or with shaking hands. You could feel where it went without looking. The release button was right where your trigger finger naturally moved, so you could drop the empty magazine and insert a new one quickly. The Mauser's fixed magazine meant no fast reloads. Once your 5 bullets were gone, you had to feed more slowly, 1 clip at a time. Some British soldiers who picked up German rifles after battles admired their build quality but didn't want to keep them. Private Harold Bolton from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote about one time in 1914 when his unit found several clean Mausers after a fight. His sergeant tried one, then handed it back, saying, "Nice gun for Sunday shooting. I'll stick with my Lee-Enfield for fighting Germans." That same story happened again and again in both world wars. After major battles, British and Commonwealth troops sometimes found or even used German rifles, but when they had a choice, they always preferred their own. Corporal Jack Thomas, who fought in North Africa with the 8th Army, kept a diary that survived the war. In one entry from January 1943, after the battles around the Meurthe line, he described how his platoon raided a German supply area. They took ammunition, food, and even a few MP-40 submachine guns, but they left behind the captured Kar-98K rifles. Thomas wrote, "The lads won't swap their rifles. Jerry's looks fancy, but ours shoots faster, and that's what matters when they're running at you." Lieutenant William Douglas Home, who served in the Royal Armoured Corps, wrote letters during the war that were later published. After questioning German prisoners in Normandy in July 1944, he noted that the Germans respected British shooting skills and how quickly they could fire. One German sergeant told him through a translator that during one battle near Caen, his squad was sure they were under attack from automatic weapons. When Holm told him it was just bolt-action rifles, the man didn't believe it. He had counted the shots himself and was convinced no manual rifle could fire that fast. Holm brought out a Lee-Enfield and showed him the mad-minute technique. The sergeant's face, Holm wrote, showed both respect and frustration at being beaten by a weapon he had thought was outdated. The respect wasn't only from the British. Indian Army soldiers, who made up a large part of the Commonwealth forces, were equally loyal to their rifle, which they called the 303 after its bullet size. Sepoyjen Singh of the 4th Indian Division wrote home in Punjabi about the East African campaign against the Italians in 1941. His unit captured Italian Karabiner rifles and German Mausers used by colonial troops. Singh tried one and found it too slow for battle. Good for careful target shooting, but not for real combat. The Indian Army had used Lee-Enfield since 1905, and soldiers from the northwest frontier to Burma all praised its dependability and speed. Indian troops fought in some of the toughest environments: scorching deserts, heavy monsoon rains, and icy mountain passes, and over again. They said their Lee-Enfields kept working when other rifles jammed. Australian soldiers were also very practical when it came to weapons. They didn't care much about rules. If something worked better, they used it. Sergeant Bill Griffiths, who fought at Tobruk and El Alamein with the 9th Australian Division, kept notes that later became part of his war memoir. He described how his unit tested, captured German equipment all the time. The Australians happily used German stick grenades because they worked better than the British Mills bombs in some cases. They also reused German optics and machine guns when they could. But Griffiths wrote that in all his time fighting in North Africa and later in the Pacific, he never saw an Australian soldier choose a German rifle over a Lee-Enfield. "The thing just works," he wrote. "Shoots straight enough and shoots fast. Why would you change?" The desert in North Africa pushed every weapon to its limits. Fine sand crept into everything like water. The days were boiling hot, and the nights freezing cold. Metal parts expanded and shrank with every temperature change. Near the coasts, the air was damp, and sand mixed with moisture to create a gritty paste that wore down moving parts quickly. Between 1940 and 1943, British forces fighting across Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia found that the Lee-Enfield handled those brutal conditions better than almost any other rifle. German troops loved the accuracy of their Mausers, but their manuals included pages of instructions for desert maintenance, special cleaning steps needed just to keep them working. The British manuals were simple: shake the sand out and keep shooting. The loose fit between the Enfield's parts, which engineers once criticized, became its biggest strength in the desert. Sand that would jam a Mauser simply slipped through the Enfield's open spaces. Australian and New Zealand troops at Tobruk fought through sandstorms so thick that they could barely see their own hands. When the wind stopped, their rifles still worked. Italian Carcano rifles, used by enemy troops, often jammed completely after sandstorms and had to be taken apart to clean. Even the Mausers needed careful cleaning before they'd fire properly again. British repair teams at Tobruk reported Lee-Enfields brought in for service with sand caked inside every part, yet most still worked well enough to fight. One August 1941 report described a rifle that had fired over 200 rounds in 3 days without cleaning and was still functional when checked. In the jungles of Burma and the Pacific, soldiers faced the opposite extreme. Torrential rain, sticky heat, and mud that made Flanders look dry by comparison. The British 14th Army fought in Burma from 1942 to 1945 in conditions where metal rusted overnight and wood swelled from moisture. Japanese Arisaka rifles, though well made, often struggled with humidity. Their chrome-lined barrels were supposed to resist rust, but once the plating cracked, it peeled and caused jamming. The Lee-Enfield's unlined barrel needed cleaning more often, but it didn't suffer from the same pitting or corrosion. Its walnut stock soaked up water without swelling too much, unlike the harder woods used in Japanese and German rifles. British troops in Burma sometimes went weeks without proper repair shops. Sergeant Charles Carfree of the Border Regiment described his rifle after 3 weeks of non-stop jungle fighting in early 1944. The metal was covered with small rust spots. The wood had turned almost black from wetness and handling, and the barrel was dirty from firing hundreds of rounds without cleaning. Still, when his unit fought Japanese positions at the Ngakyadak Pass, the rifle worked perfectly. Carfree wrote that he had seen captured Japanese rifles that looked cleaner but wouldn't shoot properly because moisture had jammed their tighter mechanisms. The Arctic was yet another test. British and Canadian soldiers who fought in Norway in 1940 and later in Northern Europe during the winter of 1944-45 faced temperatures below zero. Oils thickened into jelly, metal parts shrank, and even a breath of moisture could freeze solid. The Germans used special cold weather oils and tried to keep their rifles dry, but supplies often ran short. The British had a simpler fix. They removed all oil from the Lee-Enfield's moving parts and used it dry. It still worked. The rifle's design allowed it to fire without lubrication even in extreme cold, Canadian troops fighting in the Scheldt Estuary in November 1944 said their Lee-Enfields worked fine through sleet and freezing rain. Meanwhile, captured German rifles wouldn't budge because they were frozen. The Lee-Enfield's cock-on closing action helped here. 2, it took less force to open the bolt when the metal was stiff with cold. The Lee-Enfield's long life tells a story that challenges the usual ideas about military technology. It entered British service in 1895 as the Magazine Lee-Enfield, became the SMLE in 1907, and stayed the main rifle of the British and Commonwealth armies through World War II. But the story didn't stop there. India kept making Lee-Enfields until the 1980s. The rifle saw action in Korea, Malaya, Kenya, Suez, and even the Falklands. Canadian Rangers in the Arctic used a later model, the number 4 MLKY, all the way until 2015, 120 years after the first Lee-Enfield appeared. No other bolt-action military rifle lasted that long in active service. The Mauser 98K, as great as it was, disappeared soon after Germany's defeat. The American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, and the Soviet Mosin Nagant all were replaced within a generation after World War II. Only the Lee-Enfield stayed. That endurance wasn't because of nostalgia or lazy bureaucracy. It lasted because it got the basics right, what really mattered in battle. It didn't aim to be the most accurate or the most finely made rifle. It aimed to be the one that stayed reliable, fired fast, and worked under any conditions. These simple goals mattered more than fancy engineering. The SMLE showed that success in war depends on what works in the field, not what looks perfect on paper. The long service life of the Lee-Enfield shows that technology doesn't always move in a straight line. The rifle first entered British service in 1895 as the Magazine Lee-Enfield. It evolved into the SMLE in 1907 and stayed the main weapon for British and Commonwealth soldiers through World War II. But even after 1945, its story continued. India kept building Lee-Enfields until the 1980s. The rifle was still used in wars in Korea, Malaya, Kenya, Suez, and even in the Falklands. Canadian Rangers in the Arctic carried the number 4 MKY version until 2015, 120 years after the first model appeared. No other bolt-action rifle in military history has served that long. The Mauser 98K, even though it was an amazing piece of engineering, was replaced soon after Germany lost the war. The American Springfield 1903, the Japanese Arisaka, and the Soviet Mosin Nagant were also retired within a few decades. Only the Lee-Enfield stayed in service for over a century. This long life wasn't because of nostalgia or slow military bureaucracy. It lasted because the rifle got the basics right. The British didn't design the most precise or high-tech weapon. They designed one that worked in real combat, fast-firing, tough, and easy to use under stress. These traits were far more valuable than flawless accuracy that few soldiers could achieve in battle. The SMLE represented a simple truth. What works in real life is more important than what looks perfect on paper. Modern gun makers have had to relearn that lesson. The American M16 rifle, used in Vietnam, had major problems early on. Its tight parts made it jam in humid jungles. The same issue the Mauser had in mud and sand decades earlier. The fix was to loosen the tolerances and add chrome lining inside the barrel, exactly like the principles the Lee-Enfield had followed since 1907. The famous AK-47 became known for its reliability for the same reason. Its parts had extra space, so dirt and sand couldn't stop it, just like the Lee-Enfield's forgiving design 70 years before. Today's military training also focuses more on quick, accurate shooting at short distances instead of long-range precision. That's the same idea behind the British Mad Minute. Rapid fire mattered more than perfect accuracy at 1,000 yards. The Lee-Enfield's story teaches a bigger lesson about military technology. Being advanced or complex doesn't automatically mean being better. The Mauser was technically brilliant. Controlled feed, strong locking lugs, high-quality steel. But its complexity made it harder to maintain and easier to fail in tough conditions. The Lee-Enfield succeeded because it was simple, sturdy, and forgiving. Its loose fits, rear-locking bolt, and easy operation meant any soldier could use it and keep it running. You didn't need to be a skilled gunsmith to make it work. That mattered because wars are fought by regular soldiers and reservists, not just experts. A weapon that performs well in anyone's hands is worth more than one that only shines with professionals. There's also an economic lesson. Between 1895 and the 1950s, Britain produced about 17 million Lee-Enfields in total. The rifle was cheap to make because it didn't require super precise machinery or rare materials. Factories could be set up quickly, workers could be trained fast, and rifles could be produced in massive numbers. During World War II, when production speed was critical, this became a huge advantage. Germany made excellent rifles, but not enough of them. Britain made plenty of good rifles, arming not just its own troops, but also allies and resistance fighters around the world. Quantity and reliability won over perfection and scarcity. The Lee-Enfield proved that being old doesn't mean being useless, and being modern doesn't always mean better. It showed that knowing how soldiers actually fight is more important than what looks ideal in a design plan. Most importantly, it showed that the best weapon isn't the most advanced one. It's the one that keeps firing when everything else breaks. It's the one soldiers trust with their lives, and the one that helps them come home alive. The British soldiers' loyalty to their so-called outdated rifle wasn't stubbornness, it was wisdom.